October 23, 1944. A makeshift prisoner compound near Aachen, Germany. The autumn rain had turned the ground to mud, and 200 captured German officers stood in miserable clusters, their once proud uniforms now tattered and filthy. Oberst Heinrich Müller watched with barely concealed contempt as young American guards distributed small cardboard boxes to the prisoners. At 52, Müller was a career officer who had served in the Kaiser's army during the Great War and now commanded a regiment on the Western Front, until 3 days ago. "This is what feeds the great American army," he said loudly, holding up the box for his fellow prisoners to see. His voice carried the aristocratic disdain of the old Prussian officer class. Boxes of processed garbage. No wonder they need millions of soldiers, they're all too weak to fight properly. Around him, veteran Wehrmacht officers nodded and chuckled. These were hard men who had survived 4 years of brutal combat across 3 continents. They had fought in the snows of Russia, the deserts of North Africa, and now the hedgerows of France. They considered themselves experts in the art of war. The American guards, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit, none older than 20, said nothing. They simply handed out the boxes with slight smirks on their young faces. They had seen this reaction before, dozens of times. They knew what was coming next. Müller didn't notice the smirks. He was too busy showing off the box to Major Karl Weber, his executive officer. "Look at this, Karl. The Americans packaged their food like Christmas presents. Such waste. Such inefficiency. This is why we will still win. We are soldiers, they are shopkeepers." What Müller and his fellow officers were about to discover would shatter every assumption they held about the enemy they had been fighting. Within 20 minutes, the laughter would die in their throats. Within an hour, some of these hardened combat veterans would be weeping. The American approach to feeding soldiers came from an entirely different philosophy of warfare. In 1938, when war clouds gathered over Europe, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps assembled a team with an unusual mission: design food that soldiers would actually want to eat. Not just tolerate. Not just survive on. Actually enjoy. The specifications were unprecedented. Each ration had to provide 3,000 calories, contain complete nutrition, remain edible for months in any climate, require no cooking, and, this was the revolutionary part, taste good enough that soldiers would maintain morale even under terrible conditions. It took 5 years of development. Scientists at the Subsistence Research Laboratory in Chicago tested hundreds of combinations. They consulted nutritionists, psychologists, even chefs. They conducted field trials with soldiers marching in desert heat and Arctic cold. The result was the C-Ration, and it was unlike anything any army had ever fielded. The meat unit contained real food: beef stew with actual chunks of beef, pork and beans with recognizable pork, ham with vegetables. Not mystery meat. Not barely edible preserved slop. Real food that tasted like food. The bread unit included crackers, hard candy, sugar cubes, and, this was crucial, packets of real coffee. Not substitute. Not chicory. Real coffee from Brazilian plantations, roasted, ground, and packaged for soldiers thousands of miles from home. The accessory pack contained 4 cigarettes, chewing gum, waterproof matches, toilet paper, and a small can opener. Every single item was included for a reason, calculated to maintain soldier effectiveness and morale. But the component that would break the hearts of German soldiers was the Ration chocolate bar. Developed in partnership with Hershey, each bar contained 600 calories, was enriched with vitamins, and was specially formulated not to melt even in 120-degree heat. The U.S. Army had literally engineered chocolate that could survive combat. A young lieutenant, he couldn't have been more than 22, sat down in the mud, still holding his unopened ration box. "Mein God," he said softly. "We never had a chance. Did we? We were fighting this the whole time." Müller forced himself to examine every component of the ration systematically, as if he were inspecting a weapon. 4 Lucky Strike cigarettes in a sealed, moisture-proof pack. Chewing gum, something most German soldiers knew only from American movies. Sugar cubes, real sugar, not saccharin. A small roll of toilet paper, actual paper, not the rough ersatz they'd been using. Waterproof matches. But it was the totality that broke something inside him. This wasn't just a meal. This was a message. Every component declared with casual certainty, we have so much that we can give our soldiers things you cannot even dream of. An older Oberst, gray-haired, wearing an Iron Cross from the First World War, sat with his opened ration in his lap. Tears ran down his weathered face, cutting channels through the dirt. A younger officer approached him, concerned. "Sir, are you injured?" The old soldier shook his head slowly. "I'm thinking of my regiment," he said quietly. "My boys. They're still out there, eating turnip soup and black bread, if they're eating at all. And we sent them to fight this." He gestured at the ration boxes. "An army that feeds its soldiers like this? We sent our children to die against a nation that considers chocolate a basic military supply." Major Weber had finally opened his coffee packet, mixing it with water from his canteen. The smell drew other officers like moths to a flame. Men who hadn't had real coffee in 2 years crowded closer, just to smell it. Weber took a sip, closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, he looked at Muller with an expression of profound despair. "Heinrich, we've been drinking roasted acorns for 2 years, Weber said. They've been drinking real coffee the entire war. If they can afford to give every victory. And the Americans are giving their enemies chocolate. Chocolate. What have we done? What were we even fighting for?" The question echoed through the barracks. If the Americans could afford to feed German prisoners this well, what did that say about everything they'd been told? What else had been lies? A former schoolteacher named Joseph, now a sergeant, made an observation that hit like a hammer blow. "For 2 years, we've been told America is weak. That their soldiers are soft. That their industry only makes luxury goods with no military value. We were told they couldn't sustain a war, that their economy was on the verge of collapse." He held up his C-Ration can, turning it in the light. "This is what their collapsing economy produces. What else were we lied to about?" The question was dangerous, potentially treasonous even in captivity, where die-hard Nazis might inform on fellow prisoners. But by October 1944, with Germany clearly losing, many soldiers were willing to voice doubts they'd harbored for years. When the Americans served hot meals from their field kitchens, the demoralization became complete. Real roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables, and always, hot coffee, as much as you wanted. But perhaps the most crushing discovery came when the prisoners learned that C-Rations were actually considered inferior by American soldiers. They preferred the hot meals when available. And sometimes, incredibly, the forward units received ice cream. Ice cream. In a war zone. A German officer, learning this from an American guard, started laughing. He laughed until he cried, then just cried. "Ice cream," he kept repeating. "They make ice cream on the front lines." And we were told German discipline would win the war. As November turned to December and the American rations kept coming, no shortages, no variations in quality, just steady, overwhelming abundance, the psychological impact deepened. By March 1945, with the war clearly in its final weeks, an auberge